The prison ID number had been 407829, and for 10 years, that number defined Marcus Williams more than his own name. At 26, when the steel doors first closed behind him, after his conviction for armed robbery, Marcus had believed his life was essentially over. The young man who had made a series of desperate choices during a period of addiction and desperation couldn't imagine a future beyond concrete walls, metal bars, and the daily struggle to survive in an environment designed to punish rather than rehabilitate. Prison had been a brutal education in human nature, survival, and the long, slow process of confronting the choices that had led him there. Marcus had spent the first 2 years angry at the system, at his circumstances, at the addiction that had driven him to rob a convenience store with a gun he'd never intended to use. But during his 3rd year, something had shifted. A prison counselor named Mrs. Rodriguez had looked past his anger and his record to see potential that Marcus couldn't see in himself. "You can serve your time, or your time can serve you," she told him during one of their sessions. 10 years is a long time to waste, but it's also long enough to become a completely different person if you want to do the work. The work had been harder than anything Marcus had ever attempted. It meant facing the addiction that had driven his criminal behavior, acknowledging the harm he'd caused to his victims and his family, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding a sense of self-worth that had been destroyed by years of bad choices and their consequences. He'd earned his GED, then a bachelor's degree in social work, through a prison education program. More importantly, he'd learned to see his mistakes not as evidence of his fundamental worthlessness, but as painful lessons that could eventually help other people avoid similar paths. The transformation hadn't been linear or easy. There had been setbacks, moments of despair, and times when the weight of his past mistakes felt too heavy to carry. But Marcus had gradually developed a vision of who he could become, not despite his criminal history, but because of what he'd learned from it. He wanted to work with young people who were making the same kinds of choices he'd made, to be the person who could look past their anger and mistakes, to see their potential. When Marcus was released after serving his full 10-year sentence, he faced the reality that most former felons encounter, a world that was reluctant to give second chances to people with criminal records. Despite his education and rehabilitation, finding employment was a constant struggle. Landlords rejected his rental applications, employers dismissed his job applications, and well-meaning people often looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. But Marcus had been fortunate to connect with Second Chances Community Center, an organization specifically designed to help formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. The center's director, Dr. Sarah Chen, had seen something in Marcus that aligned with their mission, and she'd offered him a position as a youth counselor, working with at-risk teenagers. "Your past isn't a liability here," Dr. Chen had told him during his interview. "It's an asset. These kids can smell fake from a mile away. They need someone who's been where they are, who understands the choices they're facing, and who can show them that there's another way." Working with at-risk youth had become Marcus's calling, and his redemption. The teenagers who came to Second Chances were often angry, distrustful, and convinced that society had already written them off. Many came from poverty, broken homes, and neighborhoods where crime seemed like the only viable path to respect and financial survival. Marcus recognized himself in their stories and their anger, and he was able to connect with them in ways that other counselors couldn't. Tyler Jenkins had been one of Marcus's most challenging and rewarding cases. At 15, Tyler was already involved with a local gang, had been arrested twice for minor drug offenses, and was failing most of his classes. His single mother worked 2 jobs to support Tyler and his younger sister, leaving Tyler largely unsupervised and vulnerable to the influences that surrounded him in their neighborhood. When Tyler first arrived at Second Chances, as part of a court-mandated program, he'd been suspicious, hostile, and convinced that Marcus was just another adult who would judge him and then give up on him. But Marcus had patience that came from his own experience of being written off, and he'd slowly built a relationship with Tyler based on honesty rather than platitudes. "I'm not going to tell you that crime doesn't pay," Marcus had told Tyler during one of their early sessions. "I made a lot of money selling drugs before I got caught robbing that store, but I'm also going to tell you what that money cost me. 10 years of my life, relationships with my family, and nearly losing myself completely. The question isn't whether crime pays. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price it eventually demands. Over the course of 18 months, Marcus had watched Tyler slowly transform. Not into a perfect kid. Tyler still struggled with anger, still lived in a difficult environment, still faced daily temptations and pressures. But he'd begun to see alternatives to the path he'd been on. He'd started taking school seriously, distanced himself from gang activity, and developed goals for his future that went beyond immediate survival. The relationship between Marcus and Tyler had evolved beyond counselor and client into something that resembled an older brother and younger brother, or even a father and son dynamic. Marcus attended Tyler's basketball games, helped him with homework, and provided the kind of consistent male presence that had been missing from Tyler's life. Tyler, in turn, had given Marcus something he hadn't expected: the chance to be proud of himself, to see that his past mistakes could indeed serve a purpose. The Family Feud opportunity had come through Second Chances, which had been nominated for the show's special episode featuring organizations that were making a difference in their communities. The nomination letter had highlighted Marcus's story and his work with at-risk youth, particularly his mentoring relationship with Tyler. When Marcus first heard about the opportunity, his immediate reaction was anxiety about public exposure. Being on national television meant that thousands of people would learn about his criminal past, potentially exposing him to judgment and discrimination. But Tyler's enthusiasm was infectious, and Marcus realized that this could be a chance to show the world that people could change, that former criminals could become productive members of society. "Marcus," Tyler had said, when they discussed the possibility, "you always tell us that we can't run from our past, but we can use it to build our future. This is your chance to show everybody that people like us can change." The Second Chances family team consisted of Marcus, Tyler, Dr. Chen, and 2 other program alumni who had successfully rebuilt their lives after incarceration. They'd spent weeks preparing, with Tyler particularly excited about the chance to represent his community on television. Steve Harvey had been briefed on Marcus's story by the producers, but he approached him with the same respect and warmth he brought to all contestants, focusing on Marcus's current work rather than his past mistakes. "Marcus," Steve said during introductions, "tell me about Second Chances and the work you do there." Marcus stepped forward, Tyler beside him, both wearing matching Second Chances t-shirts. "I'm Marcus Williams, and I work as a youth counselor at Second Chances Community Center. We work with teenagers who are at risk of making some of the same mistakes I made when I was younger." Tyler moved slightly forward, his confidence having grown substantially during his time working with Marcus. "Mr. Harvey, Marcus is my mentor. He helps kids like me see that we have choices, even when it doesn't feel like we do." Steve nodded, with genuine interest. "Tyler, what's it been like working with Marcus?" "Marcus gets it," Tyler replied simply. "He doesn't talk to us like we're problems that need be fixed. He talks to us like we're people who can choose to do better. He's been where we are, so he knows what he's talking about." Steve was clearly intrigued by their dynamic and the obvious respect between them. The game began against the Thompson family from Georgia, and both teams proved competitive. Marcus was thoughtful with his answers, drawing on his life experience and his work with young people. Tyler was energetic and quick-thinking, demonstrating the intelligence and potential that Marcus had recognized in him. When questions came up about second chances, family, or overcoming challenges, their answers carried a weight that resonated throughout the studio. During commercial breaks, Steve found himself drawn to Marcus and Tyler's relationship. There was something about their bond, the obvious mutual respect, the way Marcus looked at Tyler with pride, and the way Tyler looked at Marcus with admiration, that spoke of a connection that had been forged through genuine care and shared understanding. It was during the fourth round that the question came that would allow Marcus to share the deepest truth about redemption and transformation. "We surveyed 100 people," Steve announced. "Name something that can change a person's life." Marcus was at the podium. The question felt like an invitation to share everything he'd learned about second chances, about the power of believing in people who had made mistakes, about the possibility of redemption, even after the worst failures. "Someone believing in you when you don't believe in yourself," Marcus said clearly. The words carried such conviction, such hard-won wisdom, that the studio fell completely silent. Steve set down his cards immediately and approached Marcus. "Someone believing in you when you don't believe in yourself," Steve repeated softly. "Marcus, that's powerful. Tell me what you mean by that." Marcus took a deep breath, realizing he was about to share the most vulnerable part of his story on national television, but feeling supported by Tyler's presence and confident in his message. 10 years ago, I was in prison for armed robbery," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the gravity of his admission. "I was angry, addicted, and convinced that I was worthless. I thought my life was over. But there were people, a counselor named Mrs. Rodriguez, later Dr. Chen at Second Chances, who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." The audience was completely quiet, drawn into Marcus's honest vulnerability. "They didn't excuse what I'd done or pretend it wasn't serious," Marcus continued, "but they also didn't let my worst moments define my entire worth as a human being. They believed I could change, could learn, could become someone who contributes rather than takes away. That belief, that someone could look past my mistakes to see my potential, that's what saved my life." Tyler couldn't stay in the family section any longer. He approached Marcus at the podium, standing beside him with obvious pride and protection. "Mr. Harvey," Tyler said, his 15-year-old voice strong and clear, "Marcus saved me from making the same mistakes he made, but more than that, he showed me that making mistakes doesn't mean you're a mistake. He taught me that I can choose who I want to become." Steve was visibly moved by Tyler's words and the obvious transformation that had occurred in both their lives. "Marcus," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "when you got out of prison, what made you want to work with kids like Tyler?" Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he considered the question. "Because I knew what it felt like to be written off, to have people look at you and see only your worst choices. I knew what it felt like to believe that you're beyond help or redemption, and I also knew that sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to give up on you." "And Tyler," Steve turned to the teenager, "what do you want people to know about Marcus?" Tyler looked up at Marcus with obvious love and respect. "I want them to know that he's proof that people can change. He made mistakes, he paid for them, and now he's helping kids like me avoid those same mistakes. He's not perfect, but he's real, and he's shown me that my past doesn't have to determine my future." Steve walked closer to both Marcus and Tyler, his expression intense with respect and admiration. "Marcus, Tyler, I need you both to understand something. What you're showing us today isn't just about redemption or second chances. You're showing us what it means to transform pain into purpose, to use your struggles to help other people." Marcus's composure began to falter as the emotion of the moment reached him. "Mr. Harvey," Marcus said quietly, "there are thousands of kids, like Tyler, who just need someone to believe in them, and thousands of people like me who've made mistakes but want to make amends. This work helping at-risk youth, it's not just my job. It's my way of paying back the debt I owe for the choices I made." Steve turned to address the studio audience, his voice carrying the weight of deep emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus just taught us something that every person needs to hear. He taught us that our worst moments don't have to define us, that people can change, and that sometimes the people who've made the biggest mistakes are exactly the ones who can help others avoid those same mistakes." The audience began to applaud, but Steve continued. "Marcus, you didn't just serve your time. You used your time to become someone who makes the world better. Tyler, you didn't just avoid making Marcus's mistakes. You chose to become someone who can inspire other kids to make better choices." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card. "I want you both to have this," Steve said, "because what you're doing at Second Chances, the lives you're changing, the hope you're creating, that needs to be supported and celebrated." Then Steve did something unprecedented. He looked directly into the camera and spoke to the viewing audience. "I want to talk to everyone watching, who's ever made mistakes, who's ever felt like their past disqualifies them from having a meaningful future. Marcus is showing you that redemption is possible, that second chances can become the best chances you ever get." He turned back to Marcus and Tyler. And I want to talk to everyone who works with young people, everyone who has the chance to believe in someone who doesn't believe in themselves. Tyler is proof of what's possible when someone refuses to give up on a kid. Steve removed his suit jacket and approached both Marcus and Tyler. This jacket has been with me through thousands of shows, Steve said. But today, it belongs to two people who've shown me what transformation looks like. Marcus, you turned your pain into purpose. Tyler, you chose hope over hopelessness. Together, you're proof that people can change and that believing in someone can literally save their life. He draped the jacket over both their shoulders, encompassing them in a gesture that symbolized the protection and support that every person deserves, regardless of their past. The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything the Family Feud studio had ever heard. The audience was on their feet, many crying openly, witnessing something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of pure redemption and hope. But the moment that would become legendary happened when Marcus looked directly into the camera and said, "To any young person watching who thinks they don't have choices, or to any adult who thinks their past mistakes mean they can't have a meaningful future, you're wrong. Every day is a chance to choose differently. Every day is a chance to become who you're meant to be." The episode aired 14 weeks later and became one of the most impactful Family Feud episodes in the show's history. The segment, featuring Marcus and Tyler, was shared millions of times, but more importantly, it sparked conversations about criminal justice reform, second chances, and the importance of investing in programs that help people rebuild their lives. Marcus received thousands of messages from other formerly incarcerated individuals, from people working in criminal justice reform, and from viewers who had been inspired by his transformation. But the messages that meant the most came from young people who wrote to thank him for showing them that mistakes didn't have to define their entire future. Steve Harvey kept his promise to support Second Chances, featuring Marcus and Tyler on his talk show multiple times, and helping to raise funds for the organization's expansion into other cities. 2 years after the Family Feud appearance, Marcus was promoted to program director at Second Chances, overseeing the organization's youth mentoring programs. Tyler, now 17, was a high school senior with a 3.7 GPA and plans to study social work in college. He still volunteered at Second Chances, mentoring younger kids who were facing some of the same challenges he'd overcome. "Marcus taught me that you can't change your past," Tyler reflected in an interview, "but you can use your past to change someone else's future. That's what I want to do. Help kids like I used to be understand that they have choices." Today, Marcus Williams lives in a modest apartment in the same neighborhood where he works, choosing to remain close to the community he serves. He's become a sought-after speaker on topics of criminal justice reform, redemption, and youth mentoring. He always wears Steve's jacket to these events, and it has become a symbol of his message that people's worst moments don't have to define their entire lives. In his office at Second Chances, next to certificates from his prison education programs and photos of the dozens of young people he's mentored, hangs a framed quote from Tyler. "Marcus didn't just save my life. He showed me that I had a life worth saving." Because Marcus had learned that the most profound truth about second chances isn't that people deserve them, it's that when people get them and use them well, they become exactly the people who can offer those same chances to others. And in a community center in a tough neighborhood, where young people who've been written off by society are learning to write new chapters for their own stories, a former convict continues to prove that redemption isn't just possible, it's powerful, transformative, and capable of creating ripple effects that last for generations. Sometimes the best teachers are those who've learned the hardest lessons, and sometimes the most powerful testimony about change comes from people who've experienced the worst consequences of bad choices and chosen to transform their pain into purpose, their mistakes into mentorship, and their redemption into hope for others who are still looking for their own second chances.